Hello, welcome to CES 2026. I'm here joined by Steve Dierten, and who is the EVP Customer Technology Partners at PTC. Hello, Steve. Great to see you here.
Great to have you here. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. And I'd love to talk a little bit more about intelligent product lifecycle with you. But before we do that, start with PTC. Tell us more about what PTC does and then who it serves.
Okay. For the broader audience, PTC's probably not exactly a household name like a Microsoft or anybody like that, but we're a fairly large software company that helps, I'll say product companies. So companies that engineer and manufacture products and ultimately service them. So take a company like a John Deere, for example. That tractor needs to get designed in, from a 3D CAD perspective, and PTC is one of the earliest companies to do that. And today, all the way through, a lot of the engineering and manufacturing needs to make products like that come to life. And at CES, a lot of that's on display.
I saw quite a few of your customers walking in earlier today, so I'd love to get a tour from you later.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. When you talk to product companies, what are the biggest challenges you've heard from them?
A wide range, right? So, customers like us, consumers, that's why we're at CES. We want more choice in the things that we're buying, right? And in our own personal lives. And that's even translating into some of the industrial technologies and things like that are out there in the world, like how we experience that technology, whether it's software and things that we're going to find in vehicles, for example, the user experience of that, the very design of it, like what's aesthetically pleasing, what's a beautiful looking car, what's that material made out of, how do you make those design trade-offs, choices that go into, developing a product like that. And then if we get into, what's happening from like a global supply chain perspective, where are my suppliers for that? What decisions and trade-offs should I make in order to make it in this country versus that country? How do I actually scale manufacturing? So, and that's all things that are inside the control of many of these companies. And then you move into things like the regulatory challenges, right? So like I'm going to make a vehicle like a Lamborghini that's out here for people to see, and I want to sell that in every country possible. But how do I meet every country's regulatory needs on safety and viability and repairability and whatever it might be? And we help customers on that broad spectrum manage that type of complexity.
So basically, you touch customer experience, manufacturing, supply chain, and data governance, almost every single perspective from everything, right? From product lifecycle perspective.
Yeah, from a product lifecycle, there's definitely going to be avenues like ERP certainly specializes in certain aspects of data that we don't, but certainly when it comes to what do engineering organizations need to do to make that product effective, we primarily are working in partnership with them to the greatest extent.
So when you talk about intelligent product lifecycle, what does it really mean in practice?
Yeah, so in the broader sense, like there's a lot of information that engineering produces that every company consumes. And historically, a lot of people might think, well, a product really just needs a drawing and engineering produces this drawing and therefore we go and make it. But there's way more that goes into that choice. Like, how was it designed for manufacturing? What materials go into it? What quality design standards? Long list goes on. And so as you start to think about all the inputs that go into a product's design, and then you say, oh, I want to make a change. How exactly would that change be tracked and traced, or understand where that change is going to affect downstream? And so the life cycle as we know it is really just managing the traceability of all those understandings, if you will. The intelligent part really kind of kicks in mostly because if you think about what could AI best do, is if you have that information managed in a particular way, AI can now understand it in a way to provide better value, better outcome, faster acceleration for companies. And that's really the intelligence portion of it, like making decisions more quickly with the information in hand.
Well, speaking of AI, right, that's very segue for our next question. Where do you see AI kind of making that significant impact from a life cycle perspective?
Yeah, let's maybe separate like the buzzworthiness of generative AI.
Yeah.
That's super important. And there's a lot of generative AI scenarios that we have offerings for our customers. So think about the requirements that go into a vehicle easily could be hundreds of thousands, if not a million, requirements in a vehicle today. Well, how, if I'm authoring those, can I accelerate the speed where I could be told, hey, that's a valid requirement. It meets the requirements. Oh, by the way, here's some suggested things that you should choose to use because I've seen that before. And therefore, from a reuse perspective, and if you think through, how hundreds of engineers at an organization like an automaker might sit down and think about it, AI can greatly accelerate that piece of it. So we're thinking about like how much time does it take to humanly curate that. Generative AI is really awesome at that. Now on the flip side though, if I say of all these designs, how do I consolidate components to save on cost? Maybe I want to consolidate my supply chain. It's not really a generative AI use case. Maybe the question is, but now I need to understand its shape. I need to understand maybe what materials it's made out of, other characteristics, and that's also an AI use case. It's just we're going to use computer vision and other sorts of technologies to accomplish that. And for a manufacturer, that could be hundreds of millions of dollars in savings a year just by driving down the cost of those components that they're carrying. So as we start to think through, like, how do we layer AI into engineering? Those are two simple examples, and many more to follow. Engineering change being the largest, because every day companies are managing change. Probably represents maybe up to half of the amount of time it takes inside an engineering organization. Is just trade-off analysis. If I change this, what happens here? What happens in manufacturing? What happens in service? And really using AI capabilities to advance that as well.
Yeah, I actually stopped by the booth earlier. I saw the Lambo demo my team shared with me. It's just very impressive to see how you contributed to the design engineer, like design thinking and simulation. But when it comes to manufacturing, as you mentioned, it could be very complex, right? Can you elaborate a little bit further on the impact of AI making it much easier today from manufacturing perspective?
Yeah, so let's keep a really simple example. Like I just want to change a component. I want to consolidate a few suppliers down to a couple of key suppliers. So in fact, let's make it so easy that we're not going to make any other physical changes. So whatever supplier we pick, that component requires no extra engineering. So we're just going to say that it's from an engineering perspective, it's as good as it gets. If you were to ask a company how many questions would need to get answered in the organization to accept that change, it easily is in the hundreds. How many do we need? Is there a minimum purchase? Is it an approved supplier? Where is it going to be located? Do we have to inspect it when it arrives? How does it arrive? What's its packaging? How do I need to ship it, store it? A lot of these questions, none of those were super difficult. But if you had to do that every day, all day on every one of those things, it adds a tremendous, I'll call it human burden. And AI is one where it can basically go and figure out a lot of those answers as we start to connect our systems. This is big. It's what Microsoft's kind of advocating with their AI strategy. It's what ERP vendors are advocating in theirs. And ultimately, if those agents are able to cooperate with each other, we can answer more and more of those enterprising questions to allow those choices to happen more quickly. And if you, again, think back to, hey, if half of my time is spent doing that, I could free my time up and spend it on things that create way more value for the customer, right? Because there actually wasn't really any value created in any of those questions I just asked. They were super important, though, because not getting it right takes more time, energy, and cost. And that's why we ask them.
I can relate to that. I actually started my career as a financial analyst for a tractor company. Right? We used to do all these analyses, but by the time we finish and the market reality already shifted, and then it's quite difficult to stay up to date with what's happening in the marketplace.
Right, and honestly, today the market moves almost instantaneously, right? And so, like the ability to make a very quick decision is super important. But a lot of companies also want to get time to market, right? They don't want 4 years of development time anymore. What if we could get it down to 3, down to 2, down to even 1? Now that's Lamborghini's not trying to make cars in 1 year. Let's be kind of clear on that. But they do want to address the market need as quickly as possible. And how can we reduce that time burden spent doing that?
Yeah, especially with product lifecycle in electronic high tech. think about it, right? It can, it's really in months rather than in years.
Right. And that industry has a unique advantage because they'll make those technologies, and the ones that they had just yesterday are expired, right? They have a very short life cycle to them because that's what the industry more or less kind of expects. But I present to you another engineering case, which is if that's the velocity of that change, how do I make sure that I can incorporate those latest changes in my products over what might be a 5, 10, or even 30-year life cycle,
Absolutely.
when the market moves like that?
Well, since you're head of customer and technology partners, let's talk a little bit about customer, how you work with customers, and then how do you help them to achieve their goals through this intelligent product lifecycle?
So a lot of customers will kind of state a mission, right? They want to get to market faster, or they want to address more variability in the markets they're ultimately trying to satisfy. Pick an industry, and everyone has a challenge, something like that. And we like to collaborate with them and say, okay, what's your greatest need, and how can our technologies best serve you to do that? Now on the customer side, that's one part of it, and on the technology side, we also say, who are your other technology providers? Is it a Microsoft, for example? How can we best integrate with what you're doing with them, to achieve that outcome? And so a lot of it is a call strategy for me to say, are we doing what we need to do to make you more capable to meet those objectives? At an executive alignment perspective, that's where I spend a lot of my time is really kind of coaching and guiding what we should all be prioritizing. And then at the implementation level, like making sure that we're achieving the objectives that we kind of set out as a true kind of partnership and collaboration.
Well, that consultative approach is very important, right? Driving long-term value with your customers. But, in terms of ecosystem partnership, how important is that? Where do you see that going in the next couple of years?
I think it's super important, especially with AI. If you start to think about like where all the data resides in an enterprise, it's considerably different than like the public consumer world. Like a lot of our personal information and the advertising side of Facebook and Google and so forth kind of fuels the generative AI engine in a really cool way for us as consumers. But if you say, how do I unleash that technology internally? Therein lies a little bit of the challenges if this data is intellectual property, right? So that intellectual property resides in other providers like an SAP, for example, or Oracle even, depending on who you choose, and Microsoft's technology and so forth. And so, figuring out how we interoperate with all of these different providers, because at the end of the day, we all share the same customers, so that the technology ultimately satisfies or delivers the objective that they want. And so that's a big part of our strategy, both with NVIDIA and Microsoft, maybe more specifically. So how do we best use kind of the technology advantages from them, or how do we even incorporate technologies from others like Ansys, which is now part of Synopsys, into products at PTC like Creo, to make the workflow a lot better for our customers.
For those people who are new to the industry, what advice would you give it to them? From product lifecycle perspective.
Yeah. So I think information is kind of critical, right? So if you start to think about like where and how the handoffs are happening in your organization, I just met with a customer, I won't mention their name, but every team has a really good process in and of themselves, but they have no really great handoff between each other. So there's actually, for example, like a trust issue. Like I really don't trust where your data came from. I don't trust where your data came from. And I don't care how much AI you bring to the table. When you have that, that's a big challenge. And so, number one is getting kind of the digital house in order. Like, where are those processes going to go? Number two, actually look at the processes that you have. What you might have been doing the last 10 or 15 years may not be how the world needs to currently work. So that should be fair territory as well. And so I do a lot of consulting on that, as well as organizational change, which is to say, how do we meet the people with technology in a way that will make their jobs more effective? Right now, and most of the executives that I meet that are relatively new, let's say coming from one company to another in the space, those are very much at the top of the list of questions that we almost are always starting with.
Well, that's very practical advice. Thank you, Steve, for sharing your wisdom with us on your intelligent product lifecycle, and really appreciate your time. And then hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. And I hope to get to show you some of the amazing customers that we have.
I can't wait. Yep.